I'm Linda Mao, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and our interviewer, Esti Garcia, speaks with Helga Aurisch about the exhibition High Society, the Portraits of Franz X. Winterhalter. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're here at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston with curator Elega Orage to talk about their exhibition, High Society. Thank you so much for joining us, Helga.
My pleasure.
So this exhibition features the work by Franz X. Winterhalter. We're going to talk about his career more in depth as we go on, but for our audience, can you tell us a brief introduction about him and his work?
Absolutely. He was born in 1805 in a village in the upper reaches of the Black Forest, which is in southwestern Germany. It's a very mountainous region, a very poor region at the time. And he was very lucky to be discovered early on to be a very talented draftsman. And as a 13-year-old boy, he was sent off to be trained in the nearby city of Freiburg. From there, he made his way to the academy in Munich. He went to Rome for a few years to study and then established himself as a painter in Paris. First submitting works to the famous Salon, which he was very successful with, and he became the court painter to a number of royals, starting with Louis Philippe of France, Queen Victoria of England, and from there on really went on to paint all the crowned heads of Europe. He left France in 1871, went back to Germany, and he died in 1873.
Is the exhibition curated in a way in the chronological order of his career? Or?
Essentially it is. Okay. Interestingly, the chronology also follows various courts of Europe that he worked for. He worked for the court of Louis Philippe in France. He worked for Victoria over a period of more than 20 years while he was living in Paris and working at the court there. Then he worked for the court of Napoleon III, who followed Louis Philippe after several years of a republic in France. And during that time he painted many of the crowned heads who either came to Paris or whom he visited when they were traveling in Europe. So it is chronological. There's one exception. We have one gallery that's just black and white.
And the exhibition consists of dresses as well. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes.
The items that are here?
Yes, I was actually fascinated by the way he paints fashion. He was considered a very fashionable painter at the time. Definitely. And he was also a great painter of fashion. He uses fashion in such a clever way to underline the beauty of his sitters, which is, I think, what made him so popular with the ladies. Definitely. And above all, he's a painter of beautiful women. So from the beginning, it was my idea to include fashions to make it really come alive and to give you the chance to compare an actual garment with how he paints.
And as you mentioned, so he had his training in Germany and Italy. What do we know about this time period?
Yes. He was actually, the area he lived in Germany at that time, in Baden, there was no art academy at all. Okay. And the only place that was nearby where he could get some training was with a publishing house in Freiburg. The publishing house Herder still exists today. And back in the day, they focused on publishing Bibles and other theological texts. And for those publications, the head of the house sought young talent, young boys, who would make illustrations for these works. Okay. And these illustrations were lithographs made after paintings by great old masters. So for the first 6 years of his artistic life, Winterhalter had to draw and to copy old masters, which is wonderful. It is incredibly boring for young boys to do this all the time, but it's the best possible training you can have because it trains the hand in such a way that you can reproduce an image very quickly, very accurately. After those years, he went on to the Munich Art Academy, which was really the most flourishing cultural city in Germany at the time, and it had a fine academy. And with support from his Grand Duke of Baden, he was able to go there and study painting because he hadn't really studied that yet. And he also entered the studio of the Bavarian court painter, a man called Stieler. And Stieler, I think, taught him really the rudiments of being a grand painter. luckily, Stieler had trained with a wonderful French painter named Gérard, who had been the court painter during the Napoleonic period. So there's a real tradition there being handed on as this kind of grand manner painter.
And what about his move to Paris? That was very pivotal in his career.
Absolutely, as you say, it was pivotal. He came back from 2 years of training in Rome, which had been subsidized by the Grand Duke of Baden. He came back, the Grand Duke made him his court painter in Baden, and within weeks, Winterhalter said bye and took himself off to Paris, where he established himself. He remained the court painter of Baden, but he worked from Paris, and it's a huge difference. Baden was relatively small and relatively poor compared to the metropolis and the art center that Paris was, and the opportunities offered in Paris were just phenomenally better than in Baden. It was a very wise thing to do.
Well, obviously he was highly praised by the royals and by the aristocrats of that time, but what about the art critics? What do they say about his work?
That's a very good question. When he first came to Paris in 1834, he started submitting works to the Salon, which was the only place to show contemporary art, and his works were praised early on. In 1836, 1837, he was the best painter really considered in the art critics' view, and they praised him lavishly. Then because of these successes, he started to be drawn into the royal circle by Louis Philippe, and he gets very, very busy painting portraits for him. And he churns out portraits at a high rate. He was very efficient. And the art critics, I think, sort of dismiss him because he's not doing anything but portraits. And portraits were considered sort of a lowly, sort of the potboilers of art, because it was something that was always in demand. It wasn't terribly avant-garde as far as art development was considered. So they kind of dismissed him. I think Winterhalter, probably read the criticism, heard the criticism, and laughed all the way to the bank, because he was just so busy painting his portraits that he just couldn't care.
How many paintings did the royals commission from him?
Oh, his oeuvre consists of about 1,000 paintings. Most of them are portraits, and many, many, many of those are royal or imperial portraits. Many are aristocratic portraits, from the circle of the courts. We only have about a handful of pictures that are not portraits. That's one of the pictures that he submitted to the Salon that made him so famous. It's called the Decamerone. It's the picture behind us here, the one that's called Florinda. And there are a few, but that's it. For the most part, they're portraits.
Well, since we're talking about the non-portraits, can you tell us a little bit about Florinda?
Oh, it's a really great picture and a great story.
Yes.
He painted it at a time when France didn't have a court. Between 1848 and 52, there was a republic in France. So he didn't have a court where he could be court painter, and he was very busy already during the 30s, or early 40s actually, to paint for Queen Victoria, whom he visited every year for several months, to paint her husband, and their growing family. In the summer of 1851, he saw an opera in London called Florinda. And he was so inspired that he painted one of his large genre pictures on this theme. And what it is, it's a legend really from Spain that tells about King Rodrigo, who is supposedly the last of the Visigoth kings, whom we see lurking in the bushes up here, spying on these lovely young girls as they are disporting themselves, bathing in this little forest glen here. Rodrigo falls in love with a duke's daughter whose name is Florinda. He seduces her, and her father is so angry that he calls in the North African Arabs, and it is the beginning of the Arab Umayyad of Spain, and Rodrigo is killed in the battle, and he essentially is the last of the Spanish Visigoth kings. So this is the story. The whole thing is just an excuse in my eyes to paint beautiful women. And Winterhalter certainly does a great job in proving that he can handle the female nude in many variations. It's beautifully painted. The textures of the fabrics are just so luscious. So it was a very lovely picture that he tried to sell. And in fact, the person who bought it, very surprisingly, was Queen Victoria, who bought it as a birthday gift for her husband, Prince Albert. Now, I've never given anything like this to my husband, and he's not getting anything like it. But it's so funny to think that she, who was the prudest and, you know, most sexually repressed, perhaps, in her outward persona, monarch, to buy something like this for her husband.
So we're standing in front of the Decameron, which is a major breakthrough in his career, from what we understand.
It's very true, and this is actually the smaller version.
Okay.
There are two versions of this picture. There's a much larger one, it's about the same size as the Florinda painting, which he submitted to the Salon in 1837, and it was really so praised by the Salon. He was medaled for it, and he became a well-known painter in Paris at the time. And if you're a well-known painter in Paris, you were a well-known painter all over the world, and the cultured world, shall we say. It is a genre piece, it's a historical scene, and what we see here is a group of beautiful young Italian aristocrats who have fled the town of Florence, which you see in the background here, because of the plague which was ravishing it. So they decided to take themselves away from that and spend the time at a villa outside of Florence. You can see the villa in the left-hand corner there. And they whiled away their time in telling each other stories. And these stories are written down by an Italian poet called Boccaccio, and it's called the Decamerone because it's a 10-day event apparently going on. And of course, like in the Florinda, what you see are beautiful faces, beautiful figures, beautifully clad, and the texture of these shimmering silks and satins are something that Winterhalter really excels at.
How did the art critics take this?
They loved it. They thought it was a wonderful thing. He took up the mantle of a French painter who had unfortunately died just a little bit earlier the year before, and so he was praised as being really very much in the moment and very timely, and it was exactly what the French market liked. We actually had considered buying the larger version of this one, which is now in a collection in Europe, but I thought, first of all, if I had the chance to buy Winterhalter, I really wanted a female portrait because that's what he's best known for. Plus, this gentleman here in these orange tights, I just thought, orange tights for Texas? It's not going to fly.
It's not in.
If you were wearing Lucchese boots, maybe, but not in tights.
Very, very neat. So we are standing in front of a portrait of Queen Victoria, a major supporter of Winterhalter. Can you tell us more?
Absolutely. It was actually her uncle, the beautiful Uncle Leopold, whom we have on the opposite wall here, who introduced Winterhalter to Queen Victoria. She invited him to come to England in 1842, and he painted this pendant set of portraits of Victoria and Albert for her. And she fell in love with the way in that he was able, what she calls, to capture a likeness, just to be able to capture the face and the expression of the sitters. She had actually been looking very actively for a portraitist since her ascension to the throne, and in her first year on the throne had posed for 15 different artists. She didn't like any of them. So when Winterhalter came, she was delighted. She loved the way he made you look beautiful, yet totally recognizable. It's just that tiny bit of idealizing that he does so well. As you can see here, she looks lovely. She was not a great beauty, but she looks very appealing here. And I think some of it is that Winterhalter had real sympathies for his sitters, and they felt very comfortable in his presence. They didn't have to sit still, they could move around. He was quick enough to capture them as they were moving about. And so she supports him for the next it's 20 years. And he comes every year to paint her husband, and then also paint their growing family. Every year he came for several months, and you can really watch their children, and they had 9 of them, grow up in front of his easel.
Very neat. And he was the only court painter?
He really was, yeah.
Okay.
He didn't have the title of court painter, but he was the only one who was used. So he would come every year, as I say, for several months, either have his studio at Buckingham Palace or at Windsor, where they resided a great deal, or down in Osborne House, where they were also. It's on the Isle of Wight, and he would paint the children in various groupings, and her husband in state portraits like this repeatedly. There's one very large set that next time you go to Buckingham Palace will greet you as you enter the Marble Hall. So that's how important the pictures still are in the royal collection. Now the Queen has the largest number of portraits pictures by Winterhalter altogether. She's 120, and Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth was very generous. She lent us 9, which is much more than anybody else did. But there were a few that she wouldn't lend, and there were particularly the pictures that are in her private rooms.
Okay.
So you can see that if they're in her private rooms, they must mean something to her today. And
something very special.
Very special.
So we're standing in front of a portrait of Empress Eugenie, very fashionably lady for her time, and a very good patron.
Absolutely, both of that is so true. She was the wife of Napoleon III, who had come to power first as the elected president of France in 1848, and then through a coup d'etat made himself emperor. He called himself then Emperor Napoleon III, and he reigned from 1852 until 1871. And he chose as his wife this beautiful woman, a Spanish daughter of a grandee, a duchess, whose name was Eugenie. And Eugenie was this lovely, petite redhead. What she chose in fashion was followed by everybody at the court, and essentially by all fashionable ladies in the world, including, Russia and America, of course.
She tried to emulate a lot of what Marie Antoinette wore.
That's
Am I
very
correct?
true, yes. She was personally very fond of Marie Antoinette, who had been her predecessor on the French throne, who herself had been a very, very fashionable person, and developed a real flamboyant style of all this lace and trimmings in satins and, of course, jewelry, etc. And Eugenie takes that up, and you can see her love of lace in this beautiful portrait. Her favorite color was mauve or lilac, and mauve is actually a color that was developed in the 1850s. It was the first synthetically fabricated color, and she adopted it as hers. So we see a lot of mauve or lilac in her fashions and in her paintings as well.
And so the catalog mentions about his rising popularity in recent years. Could you tell us why this might be it and how this ties into the exhibition?
Well, he had been largely forgotten right after his death, and it wasn't until 1988 that there was a big exhibition of his works in London and Paris. And there hadn't been one in the United States, and interestingly, there had never been one in his native country of Germany. I have been fascinated by Winterhalter for a very long time, ever since I was working on my dissertation, actually. A lot of major museums in America have works by Winterhalter. The Getty does, the Metropolitan does, many of the great museums do, and many of them have come to this exhibition. I think he's so popular or so appealing right now because he evokes an era that's gone. This whole era where Europe was at its most powerful, perhaps, has fled. It has disappeared. It disappeared to a degree in France after Winterhalter's death, when there was no more court after 1871, and then of course after World War I, when European history was completely turned upside down.
Thank Helga for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to mfah.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.